Well, thank you so very much for being here for the second session. The first session, my name is Nazanin, and there's a slight change to the program. Baroness Hodgson was going to chair this session, but unfortunately we have had a change, and Ms. Maysoon Al-Damrouji, who's a liberal Iraqi politician, because of the ongoing crisis in Iraq, she couldn't make it here today. And indeed, last night I was doing some search about the status of Iraqi women on the net. It was a very cursory check. And there wasn't much written about it, actually. And although there's a lot happening as far as women in Iraq are concerned and their loss of rights, but not a lot of media are covering it. And the latest one I found was the Human Rights Watch report about the law that was being passed as regarding that was institutionalizing childhood marriage, and so that's one issue that I found very depressing. But anyway, the first session dealt with the problems, with the statement of the problems. And I hope that this session will show us the way forward. And as such, we are very proud to have three distinguished speakers here. I'll start with Baroness Hodgson, who's I am so grateful to you for accepting our invitation to be here, because I know you're constantly on the move and traveling, and just finding the time and accepting to be here and speaking about the UK policy is so wonderful, and so thank you very much. And if I may start with you, and I'll introduce first Selina Victor, who thank you as well for being here, for accepting from the IRC International Rescue Committee. And certainly International Rescue has been very active in Syria and dealing, as we see the report here, are we listening about refugees, women refugees. Selina is the IRC UK's Policy and Advocacy Director, and she's responsible for leading advocacy efforts on core issues such as violence against women, the plight of urban refugees, and the militarization of aid. Her work is particularly focused on countries such as Syria, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Afghanistan. And she previously spent 3 years as a humanitarian worker in Darfur, Chad, and Central African Republic. And then 2 years as a Sudan researcher for Human Rights Watch, investigating human rights abuses such as attacks on civilians, breaches of international humanitarian law, impunity, and lack of access to justice. She's a qualified commercial solicitor and received a master's degree in human rights from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And thank you so very much for being here. Please.
So thank you very much, and I'm incredibly honoured to be here, and incredibly intimidated by the panelists who spoke this morning, by the audience. It's an impressive gathering. I was also going to make some crack about how nice it is to have a couple of all-women panels, but no, we've got a man on our panel. So actually, on this topic, but on this topic, actually, it's nice to see a man on the panel instead of the other way around. As you know, I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy. I've been with the IRC for 5 years, and one of the core issues that we've been working on is violence against women and girls. IRC is a large humanitarian organisation. We're relatively unknown in the UK, but we're currently working in some 30 countries. And we have a particular focus on refugees and displaced people who are uprooted by conflict, people who've had to fled their homes, and that's very much a part of IRC's mandate and history. But what makes us unique, I think, and what certainly the reason I work for the IRC, is the IRC is really committed to investing in responding to women and girls. We have a technical unit who has some of the most incredible experts on this issue, who've been fighting the fight on the front line in the midst of crisis, to understand the issues facing women and girls, and to really drive forward some sort of some sensible programs that we're now proving do make a difference. So it's incredibly satisfying working with them. Unfortunately, you'll have to make do with me today because they're all off on the front line doing the real work. So the Syria crisis, I mean, I don't think I need to tell anybody this. We're nearly coming up to the 4th anniversary. I think quite soon the Syria crisis will have been going on as long as the First World War. It's an absolutely horrifying crisis. 10 million people are affected. And it's so obvious that we don't really talk about it, but 4 out of 5 of those people are women and their children, women and girls. And yet the response is quite gender blind, as most humanitarian responses are. We tend to give out services, do what we do as standard in emergencies. We don't always really focus on the needs of women and girls. IRC's been there from very early on, since 2012, and we've provided support to close to 1 million people now. And we're working in all the neighbouring countries. We have programs now in Turkey, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Lebanon. And we also provide aid inside Syria, working across the border from neighbouring countries. We don't have a presence in Damascus. And in all of those places, we have programs for women and girls. And IRC's approach is very survivor-centred, but is very focused on providing services. So that, as a humanitarian organisation who go in and not with expats, you know, we have huge numbers of national staff and Syrian partners, but that's really the sort of fundamental part of our programme. But increasingly, it's become very, very clear that just providing services for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence isn't enough. And over the last 5-6 years particularly, we actually changed the name of this technical unit to Women's Protection and Empowerment. So as well as providing services to survivors, we work on power issues within the home, on increasing women's access to financial resources, addressing some sort of fundamental power imbalances. The other thing we do is a lot of advocacy. We do a lot of research to identify what are the real issues facing women and girls on the ground. And I want to talk today about a report that we put out in September that was really to try and take a regional view of what women, both those displaced inside Syria, but with a particular focus on the refugees, what they're facing now. It's not a big, sexy news flash report. It's not, I mean, some of the stories that we've covered this morning in depth, and the stories we're hearing about what's happening in Iraq now, those are horrifying, and of course we help people who survive those kind of issues. But I think what doesn't always make the front page is the kind of grinding level of violence and harassment and domestic violence that's going on in people's homes. So we put out a report to, not only to highlight those, but to really put out some very concrete recommendations of what can be done about it, because we don't have to just accept it. There's no reason why we can't begin to address some of these issues. Now, if technology hasn't defeated me, I'm going to try and start by playing you a short video.
طبعا ظروف الحرب أجبرتنا إنه نطلع والتجأنا لهون للأردن. الوضع المعيشي صعب شوي، بس في أمان وفي صعوبات، في هيك وفي هيك.
سوريا يعني أنت بتشعري إنك أنت بلدك. هون قد ما عملتي عم تحسي حالك غريبة؟
تخاف تطلع، تخاف حدا طبل على الباب، يعني تخاف. بسمع كثير اختطاف بنات، يعني صغار كبار. البنت امبارح تبكي خليني اروح اشتري، خليني اروح اشتري. بقول لها لا، هذا اخوك بيشتري لك. يعني ما بأمنش يطلع من باب البيت يعني.
بطلع مثلا بباص او مثلا بسياره ومش مثلا اطلع على اربد. سوريه انت ولا اردنيه؟ يعني ليش انت عم تسال هذا السؤال؟ ليش تساله انت؟ عرفتي؟ سوري اذا انك سوريه حواليك شي عروس سوريه اكثر من شوفير يعني. السوريات هون يعني وين ما بيطلعوا انه بتعرفي هون صار بسبه الحرب انه اي وحده صارت بدها تتجوز يعني تتخلص من هالوضع؟
حكت لي أمي كل شيء، إنه مسؤولية وإنه بده يصير هيك وبده يصير هيك. بعد ما تزوجت ما قدرتش أحملها، كنت يعني ندمانة، قلت يا ريتني ضليت كملت دراستي. بس هو أحيانا حاول إنه يضربني، ما عملت شيء، بس ضليت أطلع عليه، بس برفع إيديه بس ما بيضربني. بتوقع ما بعرف، بضلني أصبر.
يعني ما عاد ضل عندي ثقة بالناس. يعني أنا الصدق من امبارح أنا ماني نايمة وحاسة حالي بتوتر، يعني القصة اللي بسمعها بحس رح تصير معي، عرفت؟
بوثق فيكم وبوثق براسي وبمركز الأمان. يعني كثير برتاح لهالمكان واللي جيته. حتى وقت اللي بيجي لهون بحس حالي أخف 10 كيلو. بحكي برمي كل شيء بقلبي.
And this, I just wanted to show this. This is the woman whose picture was on the front of the report. We took the report back to give it to her, and she was so overcome with seeing it. It was just a lovely picture. So I don't suppose any of that comes as much of a shock to you. Anybody who's worked in any humanitarian context, these are stories that we hear. But it is so grinding and so oppressive in this situation. The levels of domestic violence of the people we spoke to. 70% had experienced some domestic violence, and that seems to be representative across the issues. 70% of the cases of violence that are coming to our clinics are the result of domestic violence. Despite the sort of horrors of this situation, as in many humanitarian conflicts, women are more at risk inside their homes than they are anywhere else, and that's completely unacceptable. And you know, that's going up because women can't leave their homes. Of the 200 women we interviewed, I mean, a lot of this is based on our long-term programming, but we interviewed 200 women to sort of ground truth and get additional stories. A third of them won't leave their homes. If they can't leave their homes, they can't work, they can't access education, they can't access their basic rights. It's, you know, they're living in a prison, and that's because of the levels of harassment and exploitation that they're experiencing when they leave their houses. And I know every woman on the planet has some experience of harassment and exploitation, but this is at a level that keeping people trapped in their homes. But they're reluctant to ask for help, to seek safety, to get advice, because they don't trust the authorities, they don't know what they're able to access. Finally, we've already touched on it this morning. The third issue that everybody raises is early and forced marriage. That's not new in the region, it's not new globally. You know, a lot of adolescent girls are forced into early marriage. But it is going up as a result of the crisis. And that's not a cultural phenomenon. That's quite clear from what people tell us, that that's because they've run out of other options. They're trying to keep their daughters safe, and they're trying to provide for their family in any way they can, and they see that as a viable option. So it's a pretty depressing picture. But one thing I did want to say, and I think it comes across in the video, is that the women we spoke to aren't victims in the sense that you might think of them. You know, we rarely come across anyone who isn't just an incredibly impressive, powerful, smart, energetic woman who wants to do something about this. But they've been through the most appalling tragedy, and they're now living in circumstances that all of us would find completely untenable. So I do think, you know, I agree with everything that was said about how it is for women to stand up and take control, but they can't do so without help from the international community, the UN agencies, anybody, the host governments in the countries where they're working to do something about it. Off the back of this report, we put together 8 fairly precise recommendations of exactly what we want to see in the Syria response. I won't go into the great detail of them all, but essentially it's around making sure our programs address domestic violence. That's not an easy issue to take on, but we work on it in the UK, we work on other very complicated issues. There are certainly ways to access that debate within a household to address some of the gender imbalances. we need to program specifically for adolescent girls and around the issue of early and forced marriage. And that means that making sure that families have livelihoods options, have ways to pay the rent other than selling their daughters to the landlord. We need, one thing we've called for, and we're actually making some progress on this, is for the international community to take a really hard look at what we're doing in the crisis, and are we living up to our obligations? Are we living up to the basic standards that we've all signed up to make sure that our programs don't endanger women and girls, don't create a worse situation for them? As I say, we're making some progress, but there's still a long way to go. We're 4 years into this crisis. There's no sign of the situation getting better. In fact, since this report came out, there's every sign that the situation is getting worse. So I do think, we've got a huge amount of work to do, but we've also got an opportunity that we could actually get it right in this response. We can put into play all those high-level policy asks that we've all signed up to, and really see if we can make a difference to the lives of women and girls.
Thank you very much. If I may, I think suggest that we go to you first, and then we come to you, Baroness, so that you can sum up about what the British government, the way forward, or would you like...
It's up to you, you're the chair.
I can find a rationale in everywhere.
I'm very happy with what you suggest.
So if we can come to you, Ramin John Begru, I have known him actually from high school. We went to school together, but at different times. I wish I had known you then. Probably I would have got better grades. Well, he's an internationally recognized Iranian-Canadian philosopher and the writer of the peace, the winner of the Peace Prize for the United Nations Association in Spain, for promoting dialogue between cultures and his advocacy for non-violence. He's currently professor of political science and research and a research fellow in the Center for Ethics at the University of Toronto. He's also a board member of PEN Canada and has written over 20 books in English, French, and Persian, including Beyond Violence. He's also The Gandhian Moment, which is a forthcoming one from Harvard University Press that I think you will be launching today, is it right?
Today is my
your autobiography.
It's already published.
It's already published, sorry about that. But if I may just add a bit of intrigue to this introduction. He was held as a prisoner in Iran for you can tell us more about it.
125 days.
Under 125 days. So, here probably as someone who has gone through this incarceration and still you come out of it and promote non-violence, this is my hat off to you. So, here you go.
Well, thank you very much, Nazanin. It's a privilege to be here with such distinguished panel and such distinguished audience, actually. And many thanks to Center for Opposition Studies. This is my second time here. And many thanks to Rouhi Shafii and Icavi. The immediate answer to your question is that it's because people go through violence and they become even more non-violent, I would say, and they try to tame violence. And of course, since we're not talking about me, we're talking about the situation of women in the Middle East, I think that what I will try to develop through my ideas and my paper is that women have been going through different stages of violence and different forms and different structures of violence, and how they have been trying to react to that. And I'm not trying to develop it, as one of you said, intellectually at all, and this is not an intellectual debate, it's a very pragmatic debate, it's a very realistic debate. And I would say it's even a culture war. Because what women have been performing in the past at least 100 years in that region of the world is changing not only the politics of the region, but especially the culture of the region, which we have to underline several times to understand that we have to go through from male-chauvinistic and male-oriented cultures to a more equitable and I would say more balanced and more humanistic culture. And for sure, women have been the forerunners, especially through the strategies and tactics that they have developed. And this is what I'm going to try to talk about. Now, so dramatic as the rise of violence is in the Middle East, it is undoubtedly the result of a large-scale events and performances of actions that has been taking place in the region for decades, I would say, and not only for years, but for decades. We see a lot of anger, of course, in the Muslim world against long decades of colonialism, against long decades of Western interventionism, and we also need to ask where do these Islamic movements come from? What are the reasons? What are the sources? What is the fuel of the Islamist movements of various ideological tendencies coming? Of course, nowadays, the knock is on our doors for those who are living in the Western world. I can tell you very frankly that one of the students, Canadian students with a Somalian background in my university, became an ISIS soldier and he died in Syria. And in my university, which is, has 60,000 students, 30,000 are Muslims. I mean, Canadians with a Muslim background, Pakistani, Somalian, Iranian, Turks, and many others. And of course, Islamic identity comes first for them. Certainly, Canadian nationality comes third for them. It's just a passport. But if you ask them, they say we're Muslims first, and after that we are either Pakistani, Somalis, but we want to get married to Muslims. We follow actually all our Islamic faith, and some of them, of course, become Salafis, and some of them even become go and fight for ISIS. So here I'm trying to develop the idea, the values, not only the traditions, but the values which take people to a grammar of violence, what I would call the grammar of violence. And when I said that women are making changes in the Middle East, it's because they're changing the vocabulary and grammar of politics. You know, there are many people in this room who have been political activists in their lives, in Iran and in other places, and they have been engaged in politics as activists without asking the question of this grammar of violence and why they were using the vocabulary that they were using, either as Marxists, as Islamists, or as nationalists. So here we're very much concerned with the grammar of violence, and what I'm trying to develop is how this grammar of violence that we're confronting through Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other forms of, I would say, political structures in the Middle East today, how we have to confront them and how it has been confronted with women in different places in the Middle East. So, simply because despite the immediacy and seriousness of certain political actors like ISIS or the Taliban that have caused so much violence in the Middle East, it would be difficult to understand these phenomena without having some insight and without some understanding of the role of those sociological and political actors who have opposed this grammar of violence. And of course, I think that in the case of some of these countries in the Middle East, especially Iran, women have been the most important sociological actors. Now, you see that I choose my words very carefully, and there's a reason to that. So I say also sociological actors, not only political actors, because when it means sociological, it means that you have many performances at the same time. One can rightly say that the history of the involvement of Middle Eastern women in non-violent action actually within the women's rights movements is almost as old as the movement itself, whether their intention has been to reform existing structures of power or radically to transform them. The attempts of women in the Middle East to win recognition of their dignity and thus their rights as citizens has been a central part of a more general strategy of opposing violence. I think this is a very important part to talk about. Now, as the Middle East and the world as a whole act and react to the violence created by fanaticism, and more often by fanatic men, I would say, the need for women's voices to be raised and to be heard is greater than ever. And nonviolence, in its classical sense, involves transforming the conscience of one's opponents through one's own moral agency. So I underline the work of women in the Middle East as moral agents, as people with what I call having moral capital. You know, we talk about human capital, social capital, but we have to talk about moral capital. So this means when you gain moral legitimacy, not only as a leader like Mandela or Havel, but as or Aung San Suu Kyi, but also as a movement or as a part of a society. So women have certainly in different parts of the Middle East, as Iranian, Kurdish, Iraqi, Syrian, Egyptian, they have gained this moral legitimacy also, not only political legitimacy, which I think, from my point of view, having moral legitimacy in the long term is much more important than political legitimacy. Because political legitimacy, you can lose it by one change from one regime to another. Mubarak is the best sense. I mean, look at Mubarak and Nasser and others. They had political legitimacy at some point and they don't have it anymore. But you keep your moral legitimacy. Somebody like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., they still have their moral legitimacy 50 years after they had, I mean, for Martin Luther King Jr., practically 50 years after they had been assassinated. So, nonviolence is a form of assertiveness and empowerment that enables people to stand up even in the face of overwhelming violence and retain their humanity. And how we respond to violence depends very much on the kind of violence with which we are confronted. And it depends on how best we are able to intervene effectively in any situation. Now, in the case of women we've been talking about in the Middle East, there are actually three types of violence which we need to distinguish. And of course, Rouhi and many others, Sharon, many of you here present, you did the distinction, which I will continue in the same line of thought. Actually, we have domestic violence that we just heard. In the case of Syria, we have state violence, and we have interstate or international violence. So I think these are three different types of violence which women in the Middle East are confronted with. For example, very quickly, we all have on our minds different sorts of domestic violence and how there has been opposition coming from women. Very recently they came on the streets and they tried to empower themselves, and according to KAFA, an average of 1 woman dies from domestic violence every month in Lebanon. So this is one case of which we need to talk about, and of course in 2012 the parliamentary subcommittee charged with reviewing the draft law made some considerable concessions to the religious authorities, and women still wanted to demonstrate it because they thought that on the International Women's Day they demanded for the approval of Lebanese first law against domestic violence. So this is a very good case of domestic violence. Now, we have also cases like, in case of course, state violence, we know that at different levels. One of the, I try to give you examples which are very significant examples. One of the examples that happened in Iran, I'm taking a lot of examples from my own country, of course, is how women prisoners were treated in Evin prison. And this is also very well known. Women actually, a time ago, 8 Iranian female political prisoners were sexually abused in Evin prison, and the subject has revealed a reality of sexual abuse and sexual harassment as much in Iranian prisons as in the society. And of course, they went on hunger strike. And they won their case. The interesting point is that they won their case, and they were given some more, actually from the Iranian state, told them that they will take care of the responsibles in prison and they will not be any more abused in the future, of course. And this is interesting. And they were abused by women. We have to say that too. Women who are in the states, apparatus, they can abuse women. They can use violence against women. So it's not always men who use violence against women. So this is also one of the cases which is important. Another case that all of us are confronted with is when there are wars, like in Afghanistan and Iraq. We went through wars. Now, and now Syria, of course. And the women have been at the forefront of violence during the conflicts, like in Afghanistan. And Afghan women and girls are increasingly victims of violence, within a 20% increase, actually, in the number killed or injured among the civilians. And I think that also has to be underlined, not only by the United Nations, but also by people who are at political levels in different countries, and they can make laws or pass laws or influence the foreign policies of countries like UK or Canada or the USA. So what I'm trying to underline is that there are many strategies of nonviolent resistance which has been used by women around the Middle East in order to oppose structural and political violence, and some such, we have had mass demonstrations, we have had occupation of public spaces, re-establishing the presence of voice of women as rightful citizens. And I think that sometimes it's not just because women are part of a revolution like in 1979 in Iran, or a movement like the Green Movement, which is important, but sometimes even more important is where the public discourse tries to change mentalities and put an end to what I call the mental ghettos of men, or in general mental ghettos in the societies where they're living. Now, in the case, there's a very good case of women in Iran, both secular and non-secular, meaning religious women, fighting against male chauvinism, but at the same time trying to fight against the structure of violence itself in the Iranian society. And that, I think, is a very important case to bring up. Now, we have to understand that the dynamic of this movement has been very slow, of course. It has progressed very slowly, but it remains one of the most influential social movements in Iran, and persistently it has reformed mentalities, I would say, and especially mentalities of the younger men in the society of Iran. Now, I give you the example after 2009 that we had the rigged presidential elections with the election of the second term of Mr. Ahmadinejad, and women had such a great role. As you know, many young people were killed in this movement, in the Green Movement. Now, the most important role, which I like to underline, is what we call the mourning mothers, which is, of course, the reminder of what happened La Plaza de Mayo of Argentina. the mourning mothers, which were the mourning mothers of these young people killed in 2009 in the post-election period, they, every Sunday, and their supporters gathered in a park in Tehran between 5 and 6 p.m. They were stopped from gathering, they were scattered, they were actually attacked by the security officers. But they continued with their non-violent action. Actually. And yes, and the demands actually formed a constitutional structure as announced in the official site. And what is so interesting for me is that while they were asking for their kids, either they disappeared or they were killed, or they were actually also fighting for the unknown prisoners, they were one of their demands was the abolition of the capital punishment. So they were also fighting against the mentality of violence. They were also fighting against the concept of violence. They were not only fighting for their own domestic affair, which is their sons or their daughters, but they were trying to demand the abolition of the death penalty. And I think to conclude on what I'm trying to say is that these actions which have been taking place in the MENA region in general, not only Middle East but also North Africa, which has been a long-term work of women, has played a very important role in the long-term process of democratization. Why? Because women have been taking stances in countries like Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, Palestine, Iran, on different issues like death penalty, violence against children, domestic violence against women, prostitution, as we saw, female genital mutilation, corruption actually. And in all these cases, the opposition is not only against an authoritarian system, as it comes from most of the men, and I would say male-oriented political organizations, but also against a culture of violence predominant in all these countries, in all these societies. So therefore, my point is that in the case of women's participation in the Middle East, it is the content of their opposition against violence which makes the means non-violent. It's the content which makes the means non-violent. And political opposition under such circumstances has an outright moral agenda which makes it so significant and so important. And because of that, we are not here talking only about elimination of human rights violations, which most of us have been fighting for, but we're also talking about fighting against a culture of violence, and also to equip a society, any society in the MENA region, with, I would say, a non-violent consciousness, which is growing up, actually has been growing up of decades of women's struggles, and now it is helping out actually the process of democracy making in many countries of this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Baroness Hudson of Abinger, sorry, Iranian. Member of Steering Board, Foreign Secretary's Initiative to Prevent Sexual Violence in Conflict and Post-Conflict Countries, as well as Chairwoman of the Advisory Board of Gender Action for Peace and Security, a network organization highlighting, facilitating, and monitoring UN Resolution 1325 on the inclusion of women in post-conflict resolution. She's also a trustee of the Chalker Foundation and a member of the All-Party Group on Women, Peace and Security, as well as patron of Afghan Connection. She has been a delegate at the Commission on the Status of Women, meeting at the United Nations in New York for the past 5 years. To you, Baroness.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your very kind introduction. And it's a great honor for me to be here. and quite intimidating for me to follow two such fantastic speakers. I've long been a great fan of the IRC. I mean, you do fantastic work, and I could so relate to what you were talking about as I went to Lebanon last year to meet some of the refugees coming out from Syria and the terrible stories one heard there. And also a great honour to follow the professor, and I'm sure I would benefit enormously from coming to some of your classes. But it seems very right that we are discussing this today on International Day of Elimination Against Violence Against Women, and to be having this seminar. And it is a huge subject, and I thought that the last session I heard that I caught the tail end of, there were some really interesting points, and I think we're all so aware of the enormous difficulties that women, especially in the Middle East, are experiencing right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about UK priorities and what the work being done here in the UK, because I think we're all very aware that we live in a global world today, and what happens in one part of the world affects us all everywhere, and I think we picked up on that in the first session. So I think the first thing I'd like to raise is that, you know, one of the things that we all have to do is raise awareness here, and mornings like this morning do that very well. But also for those of us involved in the political world, and I can see Baroness Morris at the back, you know, we have the opportunity to raise these issues in the House of Lords, and MPs raise these in the House of Commons, because I think we do need to make sure that what's happening in parts of the world such as the Middle East is kept on the agenda. And on the 30th of October, we did have a debate on the Middle East and North Africa, which went on for 4.5 hours, and I took part in it. I think Baroness Morris did as well. And I spoke, my speech was really focused on the fact, as Nazneen alluded to earlier, that although we see the current turmoil sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa on our television screens, what we hear is almost exclusively from men, and women are just kind of airbrushed out in some way. But these events are having, as we've heard, a significant and disproportionate impact on women and children in these countries. And Major General Patrick Camart, who was a former UN peacekeeping operation commander in the DRC, said, "It's now more dangerous to be a woman than to be a soldier in modern conflict." And I think that is so very true. And when we look across these countries, as Selina was talking about earlier, we do see some absolutely horrific things happening to the women there. So I think one of the main things we need to cling on to is that actually women's rights are human rights. And I think that's very, very important, because I think sometimes people think that women's rights are something else and there's some extreme feminist agenda that's nothing to do with various countries, but actually women's rights are human rights, and we should remember that. So although the UK is no longer considered a world military power today, we do have enormous influence across the world through soft power. Firstly, our Foreign Office. In the UK, we do put enormous emphasis on human rights, and our Foreign Office and the diplomatic network across the world prioritises defending human rights and promoting democracy. And one of the 6 global thematic priorities is in regard to human rights and women's rights. And of course, we do have embassies and high commissions in most of the countries across the world, and I know that they try and raise issues in those countries where they hear about human rights abuses and have regard to what is happening to human rights defenders there, because in many of these countries it's the human rights defenders that are so targeted, and especially the women. A big priority this year for the Foreign Office has been William Hague's initiative on ending sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict countries, of which, as Nazneen said, I'm on the steering board. And this has been a groundbreaking initiative seeking to change global attitudes. Sexual violence, which occurs all too often in conflict countries, breaks up communities and ruins people's lives. Rape is used more and more as a weapon of war, And for those families where a wife or a mother is raped in front of the rest of the members of the family, they will never, ever, ever forget that scene. So in this initiative, teams of experts have been recruited and sent out to train people in various countries on collecting evidence, giving psychological assistance, policing, law, training troops and dealing with survivors, because the real thrust of this initiative is to make sure that we end this culture of impunity for the perpetrators and transfer the shame that's felt by those that are the victims onto the perpetrators. And last week I was in Mali in connection with this initiative. I went to see there what they're doing to train the troops there, because as you probably know, there's been enormous conflict in the country. In fact, half the country is not in government control at the moment. Not only have the rebels and the Al-Qaeda groups been perpetrating sexual violence, but the troops were too. And it was, I did feel very, very proud to be British as well. We had some Gurkhas there, and Gurkha officers, and some Irish troops, and they were taking these troops through kind of human rights training and demonstrating what you do in certain situations. I expect some of you were at the Global Summit in London this summer on the initiative, and which brought together governments, civil society and survivors from across the world. And it really was, for those of us who went, the most unforgettable 4 days. And it was so heartening as everybody focused on this. I've also, as Nazanin said, been to the Commission on the Status of Women for the last 5 years, and the Foreign Office, through the UK mission in New York, works very closely with the UN. In fact, the UK was absolutely instrumental in the setting up of UN Women, which incorporated the 4 agencies of the UN who were working on women to come together and thus have more strength and focus. And the FCO and the Government Equalities Office really do support the meeting of the Commission of the Status of Women. It's the second biggest annual meeting at the UN during the year. And why is it that we never hear about it here? I mean, except for those of us who are engaged on this kind of agenda and go, the press never write about it, and it's another example of kind of women being airbrushed out of the scene. But it's attended by civil society and governments from all over the world, and it gives civil society the opportunity to raise the issues of what's happening in their countries. Now, I think it could be much better organised, and I actually promoted a question for short debate in the Lords this summer on how this was really becoming a missed opportunity, because in so many of these conflict countries, you get the governments going there, and in their presentations, they will say how wonderful they are and how they're looking after women's rights and things. And then there is another building across the road where all the civil society are holding their meetings, and sometimes what they're saying is completely opposite to what the governments are saying. So what I was saying is we need some kind of forum there where actually civil society can hold their governments to account. Our Department for International Development leads the UK's work on ending extreme poverty, and they have put improving the lives of women and girls in the world's poorest countries as one of their priorities. And of course we know that nowhere promotes inequality faster than conflict, and UK aid is working to eliminate and prevent all forms of violence against women and girls, as well as trying to get more girls into school. And not just primary school. I think there's been quite a lot of progress through the Millennium Development Goals on getting girls into primary schools, but not enough on secondary schools and going to universities. So I think that needs to be a focus going forward. Organisations like the British Council contributes enormously to the agenda by creating dialogue to influence policies that benefit women and girls, because they recognise that empowering women and achieving gender equality is crucial to creating inclusive, open and prosperous societies. And they work with partners to promote access and opportunity for women and girls to build their schools so that they can have more chance to achieve their potential and have more influence over decisions. And I've been lucky to work with them, and in the context of the Middle East. They had a big conference at Wilton Park about 3 years ago, drawing in women from across the Middle East. And then it was followed up with a conference in Istanbul, trying to teach women how to use the media better, and how to give interviews, how to write articles, how to use social media. And then I went to Tunis with them, where they had brought women from Libya to talk about addressing their rights in the new constitution. The BBC also helps the World Service. That also tries to promote equality and democracy, and not just through kind of serious programs. It also runs soap operas and things. I know in Afghanistan there was a soap opera that tried to address some of the issues that people found difficult to raise. UN Resolution 1325 has been really a central tool that we've all tried to cling on to. I find it extraordinary that despite the disproportionate impact that conflict has on women and girls, women are too often forgotten and not allowed into peace processes. They're marginalised and excluded, which means that they can't put forward their experiences and talk about the issues that affect them. And often their rights are traded as bargaining tools in the name of peace. Women's participation in peace negotiations and official roles, including negotiators, mediators, or signatories, or witnesses, is unacceptably low. Of the 24 major peace processes since 1992, only 2.5% of signatories are women. And I find that absolutely shocking. And between 1990 and 2010, only 16% of peace agreements contained a reference to women or gender. Inclusion in peace building means women's experiences and the forms of violence that they face can be addressed. And failing to recognise the different experiences of women and men during conflict threatens, it just erodes women's rights, disempowers them further. We saw this in the Geneva peace process about Syria. The women were there, they wanted to be included, and shockingly it was the UN envoy who actually wouldn't let them in. He said he had enough trouble with all the groups and he wouldn't let the women in. I just thought it was unbelievable. So UN Special Resolution 1325 seeks to address this. And the UK did play a really instrumental part in ensuring that this special resolution came into being. This year, the UK has produced a new national action plan, which was signed in June at the Global Summit with the Foreign Secretary, the Secretaries of State for Defence and DFID. And the new implementation plan on the back of this is being launched, I think, either today or tomorrow. It's this week, I know. And I'm assured that it will have some country-specific elements which will help the UK's commitment to reduce the impact of conflict on women and girls and include them in conflict resolution. Now, we've already heard from the International Rescue Committee, but they are an example of some of the work that the UK does. We have many NGOs who work in countries of the Middle East, doing humanitarian work as well as development work, and many of them, like the IRC, recognise how important it is to work on women's rights. Among other things, I'm a member of the Association of Oxfam. They also have a big focus on women's rights. And through their work, they're able to highlight abuse and urge the UK government to hold other countries to account and at times to intercede on behalf of people being abused. Nazanin also talked about the fact that I'm chair of the advisory board of GAPS, which is a network of experts and organisations working on promoting, supporting and monitoring the women, peace and security agenda. And so much of the time with these NGOs is spent on lobbying on this agenda. And one of the great outcomes from the Ending Sexual Violence Initiative, it seems to me, has been that there has been a change in the way we all work. I think governments are working much more closely with NGOs. They recognise the terrific work that they do on the ground and the experience and the way they can tap into grassroots in other countries. GAPS also runs the APG on Women, Peace and Security. It's the secretariat for it, which briefs parliamentarians and holds events in Parliament. So it's very important that we keep lobbying, that we keep raising these issues onto the agenda. I think I'll stop there. Thank
you so very much. Well, certainly, you know, you pointed out the importance of bringing civil society and NGOs with governments to bring about this change. And there were a few points that came out this morning. First of all, the legal suppression of women in many of these countries. And these countries are signatories to international conventions, specifically one that I'm aware of. But considering the shortcomings of the UN that Bayan mentioned, and I think you mentioned as well, it's not surprising that we are where we are. Certainly, Nervana made a very good point about you know, getting women in the region more involved. And certainly you with your you know, capabilities as far as the internet is concerned, you know, building a website, there should be, there's always a need for a first step. And I think you've got the verve and the energy and the drive to do it just with one website, and we can all help, you know, to develop it further. And then about Islam, I think there is many of these countries, what we share in common is a common religion, and that is Islam. And we have to admit that unless we admit our own problems, we cannot resolve them. And specifically, there are Muslim leaders that speak out, but there are not enough of them. And then when there is one, for example, in Iran, there's Ayatollah Burujerdi, who's in prison, who advocates the equality of men and women and separation of religion from state. No one pays any attention to him. The seculars don't pay any attention to him because he's a religious man, and the religious people don't pay any attention to him because he's promoting principles that they are against. So there he is, lost in prison, and no one is listening to his voice. And lastly, the pace of change. We keep hearing that in Europe it took us 200 years to bring about change. But in last 200 years, there was no technological advancement, there was no internet. And certainly now, with all these tools at our disposal, I think we can bring about change at a much faster pace. And with people, figures like yourselves, you know, there's a lot of hope in doing that. Now I open up. Now I open up the floor to questions. Please identify yourself and the organization you're from before asking your question. You first.
Me? Okay, I'm Roya Shafii. I'm the head of the Human Rights Committee for my own organization. I'm also a co-founder and advisor with I want to pick up from where Bayan ended the last panel, and she posed a question about human rights being seen as Western, and the fact that it was written 66 years ago by the victorious Christians who ended the Second World War, and how constantly, as human rights defenders, we are hit with this in our face every time we talk about the universal values of equality and equitable treatment. And you come from three separate approaches to this idea, and I'd love to hear how you approach this idea of universal rights of human beings, the equality and equitable treatment, and how you bring that to cultural relativism and the fact that we're constantly told, well, it's wonderful to have the diversity and it's wonderful, which is fine, but then we're getting abused in the name of these cultures and these traditions. You talk about empowerment, Selina, in the work that you do, and I love to hear how you approach this when you're talking about educating and empowering women within the region. Baroness, you talk about the international efforts. Again, you are going to regions that are versus cultural relatives of human rights. Thank you.
My name's Natasha Phillips. I'm a barrister running a child welfare project inside the family justice system. And we've recently been looking at child abuse and exploitation within a faith context. Obviously, language is a very powerful tool in the quest for freedom, so I'd like to ask the panel if they feel that now's the time perhaps to start reshaping the discussion and the language that we use, being more culturally sensitive perhaps, and trying to find ways in which we can use language which is relatable to women who are still unsure about the discussion surrounding freedom, human rights, equality, but perhaps most poignantly looking at using language which engages positively those men who are actively resisting it today.
Yes.
Nervana Mahmoud, I'm a blogger and presented earlier. Just the Professor Ramin, I'm impressed.
Just call me Ramin, please.
Professor.
Yes.
I'm just impressed about your talk about non-violence, because the talk now, there is avalanche of articles and review articles and pieces from pundits around the group to say, unless we sort out Syria, all the youth will turn up to violence. So as if it's either a solution or violence. Very few who are promoting non-violence in the region, because people see it as either soft or ineffective. And I would like your thought about that.
Okay, so we'll go with this, the 3 questions, and then we'll come back to another round. Please, Darnis.
Please call me Fiona.
Okay, sorry.
The first question was on human rights being Western. Yes, I know this is a real issue, and I think in the Middle East it's not only that it's Western, it was the domain of the dictators, and there's whispers about that and it not being Islamic. Well, I suppose the first thing I would say is women's rights are work in progress everywhere. There is no country in the world where, when you look in social, political and economic terms, women have equality. So, yes, we may be a bit more advanced here, but we're still working on it. We don't have enough women in leadership positions, we don't have enough women in parliament. So, and also, our society, too, can be pretty male-orientated in places. But it's obviously not like as bad as it is in some of the Middle East countries. Well, I suppose I would firstly draw you to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I think that most of these countries are at the UN, and I think it's my understanding that they have to accepted the Universal Declaration of Rights to be at the UN. So that would be my answer to that one. And it's also, which in a way ties in with the second question about reshaping language, Natasha's point about reshaping language. I think if we're really going to make strides forward, we have to work with men. Not all men are kind of anti-women or committing violence. We need to get those men on board and explain to them why it's better for them and their societies that women have more equality, and how they're actually stopping women contributing to society by doing this. And actually, it's in their interests that women should have more equality. So, but I think we really do need, I think language is very important. I think the way we talk about things, I think those of us who in the West who visit these countries, I think we need to listen and not preach and not dictate. And I think in a lot of the NGOs, they work through local partners, and I think that's incredibly important, because I think in some places we've made mistakes, places like Afghanistan that you alluded to in your remarks. I think we made too many mistakes about going in, talking about women's rights and not being culturally sensitive enough. So I think that's a very good point.
Yes, thank you. On the point about cultural relativism, I mean, I'm not a professor of philosophy of human rights. I've studied a bit, but my understanding is that a huge amount of work has been done tracing back those same values to every major religion, to every culture. They are expressed as Western, and I realise we have to address that fact, and that's to do with historic balances of power, and can only apologise for the Empire again. But you can trace it back, and a lot of really important work is being done so that they're not seen as Western, so that they are seen as universal. And within our programmes, it is incredibly challenging, and it would be more challenging if it was me walking into a household in Lebanon working with it, but that's not how we work. 98% of our staff are from the country where we're working, or from the communities that we work with in the case of refugees. So the conversation is much easier. It's very difficult to go in and confront these issues head on, but somebody mentioned the fact that we focus on empowerment. The same things empower Syrian refugees as empower me: knowledge, understanding of my rights, understanding of the impact it will have on my daughter if I sell her into an early marriage. Being able to have those conversations within the family. We work on policy issues, we work with host governments to try and enact laws that try to resolve some of these issues. It is a massive work in progress. But I just don't think beating your wife is culturally appropriate sort of anywhere or justifiable anywhere, and yet it happens up the street from here too. So.
Yes.
In the case of human rights, I think that the best way to extrapolate and to talk about it is that human rights is the outcome of a long process of rationalization. And many Muslim philosophers and thinkers contributed to this process of rationalization in the West or in the East. I mean, the two good examples are Averroes and Avicenna, who contributed actually, as you know, to the European Renaissance. So this is a wrong, I would say, a wrong way of taking it. And cultural relativism, if people come and say human rights is Western, and we say that in the name of cultural relativism, there are two ways of talking about cultural relativism. One is actually the cultural relativism that we're seeing today in the West as a reaction towards cultural homogenization and cultural globalization of our world. And the second one, which happened actually around 56 years ago when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written, and the reaction came from South Africa with its apartheid regime, and from Saudi Arabia because it promoted slavery, and as you know, they both didn't sign and ratify the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They did it in the name of cultural relatives, because they said, this is our culture, these are our cultures, we want actually to accept either slavery or we do accept inequality, and this is part of our apartheid regime and this is part of our Saudi regime. No, this is no more acceptable, of course, coming from our side. And why is it not acceptable? Because we are not only talking about change either in the West or in the East. We're not talking about only changes of institutions. We're also talking, and that was my point, we're talking about changing mentalities for our younger humanity, I would say. And these changes of humanities, nonviolence is a very important part of it. Now, nonviolence, I say in two words, nonviolence, when we talk about nonviolence and people come and say, well, it's too soft, it's too weak, it cannot work against ISIS or against Al-Qaeda. It's not about making new Mahatma Gandhis, actually. You cannot make new Mahatma Gandhis. It's not the case about having Mahatma Gandhis. It's about the question of taming of violence. Now, liberalism is all about taming of violence, you know. And now, how do you tame violence? Either you do it through lawmaking, as it was done, you know, in this country, for example. You make laws. So, for example, you abolish capital punishment. This is a way of taming violence through laws. Or you do it through culture, through education. You educate citizens. Actually, citizens educate themselves to not promote violence. And I think that there cannot be any democracy making, and that was our error for a long period of time in the state building in the Middle East. There is no democracy building without peacemaking, without peace education, without teaching the younger generations, even kids, I would say, in the Middle East, to teach them to tame violence at all levels. And this is actually raising awareness, and this is how you empower people in these societies.
Certainly, there should be peace within to have democracy. And which reminds me of the Academian tablets that these are 3,000 years old, and they're now housed in the University of Chicago, that give the same rights to women and 3 times the pay to pregnant women working, and labor rights. These are in Iran, in Persia. Yes. Anyway, please.
Just one question. I fully endorse what Robin said about the language of relativism, and I think that...
Introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Sharon Tabari, I'm a journalist and work as an advisor at the Legatum Institute. I think that what we should propagate is to say that the human rights and women's rights are the universal values. They're not property of the Western culture, at all. And this is what we have to, rather than giving in to a very violent or anti-women or anti-human rights discourse of those countries. Another specific question I wanted to ask you, please. Why is that whatever we see from Syrian refugees or Syrian women these days in media and also in your video is the women with the Islamist dress code? I mean, Syria is a very multicultural, diverse society, and there are women like us in there, but we never see that face in the video. What is the reason for that, please?
Thank you. It's Mohammed Abdelhak. I'm the chairman of the center, and I do apologize. There was an accident on the M25 this morning. But I just would like to comment on the universal issues and, those people who are anti-universal values, in fact, they are only the backward people. Because interestingly enough, they do drive cars, and cars are Western. They do use mobiles, and mobiles are Western. This is only to defend their demagogue attitude, and mainly they are the Salafists, in whatever shape or form. And it is, I think, recently I read an article given by a Jordanian thinker. According to him, there are 50 civil wars currently going on in the world. 45 of them, Muslims are a party to that. 30, the Muslims are a party to both parties of the conflict. So basically, link it to our women issues. Unless we address the civil and civic conflict within Muslims. I don't talk about Islam. There are plenty of books, and we all know about Islam, how full of good values, and we have definitely an issue with Muslims. And unless those issues are brought up to the surface and addressed and confronted, not by being apologetic about universal values. Killing is killing, whether it was in Oxford, or whether it was in Syria, or whether it was in New York. And rape is rape. There is no values, there is no culture could interpret it differently. So I think I strongly advocate not to allow my Western friends and colleagues to start to be apologetic about those universal values. And one final comment, because I live in Oxford, and ISIS is a very beautiful river, so I would like to advocate to call it ISIL, rather than ISIS. And it's a serious comment, actually, because ISIS is a very beautiful name, and it shouldn't be tarnished by a few terrorists.
Can I just make a very quick comment?
I just really want to clarify where this discussion about human rights and so on came. And I think my point, maybe I just didn't make it very clearly. I was thinking about the counter-narrative to organizations like ISIL. They have their narrative, they have a book, they have a guidebook to savagery, they have the Quran that they choose verses from selectively. What the West lacks is a counter-narrative. There was also a question from the audience about how do we encourage women in the Middle East to be aware of their rights. I pose the question, I accept the Universal Declaration of Rights. I'm from Kurdistan, I'm Muslim, but I accept it. But there are young people on Twitter, on Facebook, who are being bombarded by the opposite ideology. There isn't a narrative that tells them, for example, that human rights goes back to various cultures. You intellectuals might know that, but the average kid on Twitter and Facebook doesn't know that. That was the point I was making. I wasn't questioning the right of universal human rights. I was questioning how do we convey the message to women in the Middle East and young people who are confronted by ISIL that their rights are in their culture too, or that their rights, these universal human rights, haven't just been written by a bunch of Christian men 60 years ago. That was the point.
Can I just make a very quick comment?
Quick, because we've got...
Yes, I'll be very
yes,
quick.
yes.
In October, when Iran was engaging with the international UN mechanism and having a universal periodic review, the explanation for lashes, for stoning, and for a lot of other violations that violate its engagement in international community was, please respect our cultural differences, allow us to have our differences. That was the message that the Iranian delegation, the Islamic Republic delegation, brought to the UN while its human rights mechanism was being valued. That was really my point, that when we talk about universal rights, then we have governments that come to the international fora and justify abuse of their citizens under the name of culture, tradition, and whatever it is that they're doing. My question really was, how do we address that? How can we overcome that? But that's a different matter now. Thank you.
Robin
Introduce yourself.
Perocurian strategist and an artist. Robin categorized violence into three: domestic, governmental, and international. Is there a fourth type of violence, like peer violence, or community violence, or maybe cultural violence, where individual allow itself without being connected to the government? I mean, some of the acid attacks or humiliation of women or abuse and assault of women is from one individual to another. So is there a fourth type of violence which might be academically called cultural violence?
And Rita.
Yes, I just wanted to make, sorry, my voice is going, the experience of Iranian women and now spreading into the Afghan women, which I am, witnessing, and with the Iranian movement I've been a part of for the past 30 years. I think the experience of the Iranian women is a very good example that they are mixing the Iranian culture, as if there is an Iranian culture, which personally I think is quite a mixed culture of many cultures. They are using that with the principle of human rights these days, especially the young generation. Not even women, but men as well, young men as well. And I've seen quite a lot of Afghan girls and a few men who have lived in Iran and gone back to Afghanistan. And they have developed on that. I think the picture that we gave today was a very gloomy picture that we have in the area, which it is. But still there is a window of hope. And that hope, I'm sure, with the Iranian women, because the movement, the Iranian women's movement is a huge movement. We thought after 2009, it's finished because most of them came out of Iran, but it's not. If you look at it, a younger generation has emerged, and I think the future is not as bleak as we see today or we portray.
Okay. And last, yes, observation.
My question actually
introduce yourself.
Yes, Iranian human rights lawyer and association member of the Icavi. My question is from Baroness. Actually, I'm wondering, because after your explanation about Mali and how you involved with the situation, I'm one of the members of your campaign. I really appreciate your actions regarding great issues in the conflict. But my question is, in terms of your actually historical helps in some countries, in terms of donation-based helps that you can name, is I'm wondering if your views and approaches have been changed, or because what I'm seeing is going there and helping and directly educating soldiers. But what I think is mostly important is how you get involved in changing law and educating the governmental body of the countries. Just because the issue I was thinking.
Fiona.
Okay, do you want me to start with that? Well, actually, in countries like Mali, we never had a historical presence. It was actually France. And what's happened there about the soldiers was actually the Mali government needed help, because earlier this year they tried to go into this part of the country which really isn't under government control, and the Prime Minister went with some of the soldiers. and the rebels attacked them, and in 7 minutes they fled, leaving all their equipment that the EU had given them and various things like that. So the Mali government recognised it had a terrible problem with its army, and that if it was going to actually be a stable country again, it needed to get the army operating better and better trained. And so it had appealed to France to come in at some point to help push the rebels back when they got very close to the capital. And so it's an EU training mission there. And into that EU training mission is the importance of not just shooting civilians and the rights of people, and the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative has come in as part of the training pack. So that's how that has happened in Mali. Yes, of course.
It was just an example. I mean,
Yeah.
it's quite a picture of what you actually do, how you get involved in the region.
How am I?
I mean, UK government get involved in the regions in terms of rape issues. I'm seeing in what your picture is mostly like directly going and campaigning instead of more like emphasizing the measures and changing law and more actions. Yeah.
Well, as I said earlier, I think, through our embassies and our diplomatic missions, there's obviously, they try and put pressure on the governments to actually address human rights abuses and things like that. Personally, of course, when you go to these countries, it does change you. You see things, you learn things, you listen. And I often come back thinking we are so lucky to live in a country with rule of law and proper institutions, because I think that's part of it. Just on the point about the counter-narrative to ISIL, I have to say it upsets me that there's Islamic anywhere in the title of these people. It doesn't seem to me that it's anything to do with Islam, what they're doing. I'm not an academic or a theologian, but my understanding is that Islam never encouraged the kind of behaviour that they're doing. But yes, we do need a counter-narrative, because I think their narrative is very strong, and I think all over the world where people are poor and young feel they have no future, it was described to me that it was a message of glory, God and gold, which is very seductive for uneducated people. And I can see there are young men going from all over. I was in Kyrgyzstan earlier in the autumn, and people are going from all over there. And it is now, as somebody said this morning, a global problem, because when they come back, they're going to spew with this rhetoric of hatred all over the world and encouraging terrorism in these places. So I absolutely agree with you. It does need to be a counter-narrative. And it really needs to be probably from people who are Muslim, who can actually say, that's rubbish what they're encouraging and saying, because obviously people like me who are pretty shaky on the theological arguments of regarding Islam would be shot down. But yes, we do need a strong counter-narrative which is telling people about the truth.
So that was a very sort of rich, I've scribbled some things frantically. I mean, just one point to come back on the sort of building capacities of government and what the PSVR, what the UK government can support. In a lot of the places I've worked, there are people within government institutions with the right ideas who want to do some good. Even in Central African Republic, when they were in the midst of whatever was going on, and they want, but they don't have any capacity. Quite often, those places are run by 5 people. So to provide them with some capacity to actually move it forward really helps. But then, of course, there's all the work around movement building and empowering and helping people understand their rights. On the point about the sort of, the Islam being implicated in multiple conflicts, yes, the situation in the Middle East is in meltdown at the moment. I'm very, very nervous of a sort of clash of civilizations type of rhetoric that only feeds into certain sort of attitudes to Islam, which I think is unhealthy. And the fact is that religion and culture have been implicated in violence everywhere. You go to Rwanda, go to the Crusades, look at what the Catholic Church, frankly, has done to children and to women. historically, and it is constantly used as an excuse. Violence is not about religion or culture, it's about power. That's all it's about, whether in an individual rape or because women can't access work or education or the kind of really structural level abuses that we're talking about. It's about power, and the only way that we're really going to put an end to it is working towards equality, is addressing that power imbalance.
Yes, answer to two questions actually. First of all, cultural violence as the fourth type of violence. Well, you know, the state violence or interstate violence or have also a cultural actually angle to it. So I don't think that we can use cultural violence as a fourth type, because actually we can talk about intergroup or inter-individual. Now we talk about domestic, but domestic is actually inter-individual violence. And intergroup violence could be part of this domestic violence too. As there's a second point that I want to make, which I think is quite important. And first of all, for the counter-narrative to ISIL, I would prefer to call it a BISIL, in a barbaric state of instead of Islamic state, barbaric state. Yeah. But I mean, on barbarism, you know, there is something which, sorry, pardon my French, because I lived in France for 20 years and I studied there. There's something which pisses me off. And that's the fact that I think that and it happens in many places in the world, not only in the East or in the Middle East, but also in the West. And it's when when it's about the power sharing of women, and when we ask them, or when men ask them to become ministers or vice ministers, and they say, since we have a female minister or a female vice minister, there is equality among men and women in that society, which is not true at all. I mean, it happens many times in different places. I mean, we have it in Iran, we have it in Turkey, we have it in many places. Now, for me, what is most important is that women don't repeat the male chauvinistic values which have been actually through centuries and through decades imposed by men. If they, in the name of a minister, female minister or female vice minister, they repeat the same values, nothing is going to be changed. That's what I call the grammar of violence. The grammar of violence is pronounced just by a female, instead of being pronounced by a male, you know, prime minister. It's going to be a female prime minister. We had examples, you know, in this country we had examples of a lady who had the same grammar of violence actually, and a very manlish way actually, I would say. So I don't think that we need to repeat that in the same way. I mean, it's very important that we promote the culture of violence, but by changing the values, not just by changing the figures, like in a staging politics.
Well, thank you so very much. It has been a truly educational and enlightening day for me. For a lot of good points were made, and I thank you so very much for being here. To you as well, and please, lunch is being served.